Eliza Crow poured her last water, the very last water she had in this world, onto the cracked lips of a man she had never seen before in her life. Her hands were shaking. Her own throat was so dry it had stopped hurting 3 hours ago. The little girl in her arms had gone still, and the man on the ground wasn't moving anymore. She didn't know his name. She didn't know he owned half of Montana. All she knew was that they were dying, and she could not walk away. If a story like this moves you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The summer of 1883 came to the Montana Territory like a punishment nobody had earned and nobody could escape. The creek behind Eliza Crow's cabin had been dry since April. The well had gone bitter in May, drawing up water so thick with mineral taste that even the mule she no longer owned would have refused it. By June, Eliza had stopped trying to keep track of what she didn't have anymore because the list had grown so long it had become the whole of her life. She was 34 years old, though most folks who saw her, which wasn't many, given that she lived 4 miles outside of Ridgecrest with no horse and no reason to walk into town, would have guessed older. Hard years had a way of settling into a woman's face and staying there. She was a big woman, broad through the shoulders and heavy through the hips, built the way her mother had been built and her grandmother before that, the kind of body that men in town called unkind names when they thought she couldn't hear them, and sometimes even when they knew she could. She had learned a long time ago not to flinch at it. You couldn't spend your energy flinching at every cruelty this world threw at you. You'd be too tired to stand by noon. Her husband, Thomas Crow, had been dead 2 years. He had died of a fever that the doctor in Ridgecrest had refused to ride out to treat on account of the Crow family not having enough money to make the trip worth his while. Thomas had lasted 6 days after the fever took him. Their son, baby James, had followed his father into the ground, 3 months later, a tiny coffin that Eliza had built herself from the planks of the old barn wall because she couldn't afford to buy one. She had dug both graves herself, too. Nobody had come to help. She didn't talk about any of that. There was no one to talk to. What she did instead was survive. She kept a small garden of hard vegetables that the drought was slowly murdering. She collected water in every vessel she owned when it rained, which it had not done in 6 weeks. She traded needlework to the general store in Ridgecrest twice a month and walked the 8 miles round trip to do it because pride was the one thing this territory had not yet managed to take from her. And every morning she got up before the sun and reminded herself that she was still here. That had to count for something. She hadn't yet figured out what. On the afternoon that changed everything, Eliza was out behind her cabin trying to coax one last bucket from the well when she heard it. A child's voice. Thin and ragged and barely there, but unmistakable. The cry of a little girl in real trouble. Not the kind of crying that came from scraped knees or bad dreams, but the desperate, breathless kind that meant something was genuinely wrong. It was coming from the east, out past the flat stretch of cracked earth that locals called the basin a wide-open expanse of nothing, where no sensible person walked in the middle of a summer afternoon without a horse and a full canteen. Eliza stood still for a moment and listened. The sound came again. She didn't deliberate. She didn't weigh the risks or calculate what she could afford to give. She was already walking. The heat hit her like a wall the second she stepped beyond the shade of the cabin overhang. The basin was brutal in the best of seasons, and this was not the best of seasons. The ground was pale and fractured dried mud cracked into 1,000 jagged pieces that crunched under her boots. The air smelled like hot iron. The sun was positioned almost directly overhead, and it had no mercy in it whatsoever. She walked for 10 minutes, scanning the flat ground, and then she saw them. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, on her hands and knees in the dirt. Her dress was torn at one shoulder, and her dark hair was matted to her face with sweat. She was moving, barely crawling toward nothing in particular, with the mechanical determination of a creature that had forgotten why it was moving, and was only moving because stopping felt like dying. 20 feet behind her, a man. He was large, she could see that even from a distance, tall and broad, and the kind of man who probably looked formidable under normal circumstances. Right now, he was face down in the dust, one arm stretched forward like he'd been reaching for something and hadn't made it. His hat was gone. The back of his neck was burned red. He wasn't moving at all. Eliza broke into the fastest run her body was capable of, which was not graceful, and which she did not care about in the slightest. She reached the little girl first. "Hey!" She dropped to her knees in the dirt right in front of the child, getting her hands on the girl's shoulders, steadying her. "Hey, sweetheart, look at me. Look at me right now." The girl's eyes were glassy and too bright. Her lips were cracked and bleeding slightly at the corners. She focused on Eliza's face with visible effort, like she was trying to see through fog. "My papa," the girl whispered. Her voice was almost gone. "He fell down. He told me to keep walking, but I can't. I can't leave him." "You did right." Eliza was already pulling the child up against her, getting her arm around her, taking the girl's weight. "You did exactly right. Where are you hurting?" "All over." The girl's head dropped against Eliza's shoulder. "I'm so thirsty." "I know." Eliza was moving, already half carrying the child toward the man on the ground. "I know you are. We're going to fix that. What's your name?" "May." The girl breathed. "May Hart." "All right, May. I'm Eliza. You hold on to me." She reached the man and crouched beside him, keeping May pressed against her side. Up close, she could see the rise and fall of his chest, shallow but present. He was breathing. His hands were torn up. She noticed palms scraped raw, like he'd been crawling, and there was dried blood on his chin from where he must have hit the ground when he fell. He was maybe 40 if she had to guess. Lean through the jaw, strong through the neck and arms, even in collapse. There was something in the set of his face, even unconscious, that suggested a man not accustomed to being helpless. "Mister." She pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, found his pulse rapid and thin, but there. "Mister, I need you to hear me." Nothing. "Sir?" She was less gentle this time, getting her hand against his face and turning his head toward her. "Wake up. Your little girl needs you to wake up right now." His eyes opened. They were dark brown, those eyes, and it took a few seconds for them to find her face. But when they did, there was something in them that was still sharp underneath the haze of heat exhaustion. He was fighting to stay present. She could see him fighting. "There you are," she said. "Can you hear me?" "Yeah." His voice was barely a sound. His tongue moved over his cracked lips. "Yeah, I hear you. Your daughter is with me. She's all right. She's going to be all right. But I need you to help me get you up, because I cannot carry a man your size by myself, and my cabin is 10 minutes back that way." She held his gaze. "Can you do that? Can you get up?" His jaw tightened. She watched him assess himself, the inventory a man takes when he's not sure what still works. "My legs," he said. "I think I can. Yeah, give me your arm." "Take it." He got one hand around her forearm, and she braced, putting her weight into it, and he came up off the ground in stages, first to his knees, then with a sound low in his throat that he was clearly trying to suppress, all the way to his feet. He swayed. She was right there, solid as a post, and he caught himself against her shoulder. "I got you," she said. "Don't fall on me." "Not planning on it." A ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "Hart. Caleb Hart. Eliza Crow. We can do the formal introductions once you're not about to die. Walk." He walked. It was slow going, and it was ugly, and May could barely manage her own feet by the end of it, but Eliza got them both through the cabin door and down onto the cabin floor, because there was no time to be particular about furniture. She settled May against the wall with a folded blanket behind her head and turned to the water situation, which was grim. She had 1 full jug. 1. She had been saving it, rationing herself to 3 small cups a day, calculating how long she could make it last if it didn't rain. 3 days, maybe 4 if she was disciplined. She looked at the jug. She looked at the man slumped against her wall, and the little girl whose lips were bleeding from dryness. She picked up the jug and brought it to May first. "Small sips," she said, holding the cup to the girl's mouth. "Slow. Don't gulp or you'll bring it back up." May nodded and drank, careful and obedient, though Eliza could see what it cost her to be careful when every instinct was screaming to swallow as fast as she could. Then she brought the cup to Caleb. He had his eyes open, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something careful in it, something that was taking stock of her without being unkind about it. "You're sure?" he said, looking at the jug. He'd seen how much was in it. He wasn't a stupid man. "Drink," she said. He drank. She allowed herself half a cup and used the rest to wet a cloth for May's forehead, which had gone frightening warm. Heat had gotten into the child badly. That was the more serious problem. Caleb was exhausted and dehydrated, but May had crossed into something that could turn dangerous fast if the temperature didn't come down. "How long were you out there?" Eliza asked, wringing the cloth and pressing it to May's neck. "Since before noon." Caleb's voice was coming back a little steadier now. "Lost the horses 3 hours east of here. Something spooked them during the heat storm this morning. We'd been walking since." 3 hours east. She kept her voice even. "You walked for 3 hours in this." May was slowing down. "I was carrying her for the last hour and a half." He paused. "Then I couldn't anymore." He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man states a fact he isn't proud of, but won't dress up to look better than it was. She respected that. "Where were you headed?" Something shifted in his face, a door closing, quiet but deliberate. "Visiting someone," he said. "A grave." She didn't push. She understood about graves. "There's a town 4 miles west," she said instead. "Ridgecrest. Once you're steady, you can send word from there. Someone will be looking for you, I expect." "Yes," he said. "They will." Again that odd quality in his voice, something underneath the words that she didn't have enough information to interpret. She filed it away and focused on May, who had stopped shaking quite so badly and whose color, while still pale, had moved back from the edge it had been at. "She's going to be all right," Eliza said, more to herself than to him, pressing the cool cloth to the girl's wrist. "Fever needs to come down a bit more, but she's strong." "She is." Something rough moved through Caleb Hart's voice. "She's the strongest person I know." May opened her eyes at that. Even half delirious, she'd heard it. "You always say that," she murmured. "Because it's always true," he said. Eliza watched the two of them look at each other across the small space of the cabin floor, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the particular ache that comes from witnessing love between people. When you have been alone so long, you'd almost forgotten what it looked like. She stood up and went to check on her water situation, so she had something practical to do with her hands. What she did not do, what she could not have done, because she had no possible way of knowing, it was connect the name Caleb Hart to anything in particular. She had been isolated for 2 years. News from the wider territory came to her in fragments, weeks late, filtered through the gossip of the Ridgecrest General Store on the days she went to trade her needlework. She knew the name of the man who ran the bank. She knew which families had been buying up land along the northern corridor. She did not know, had no reason to know, that Caleb Hart of the Black Mesa Ranch was arguably the largest private landowner between Billings and the Canadian border, that his holdings ran to something in the neighborhood of 40,000 acres, that he employed over 200 ranch hands across 4 separate operations, and that his late wife had come from one of the oldest and wealthiest families in the Montana Territory. A family that was currently, as it happened, very interested in where Caleb Hart and his daughter had disappeared to. She didn't know any of that. She just knew there was a man in her cabin who was alive because she'd found him in time, and a little girl whose fever was starting to break, and one jug that was now mostly empty, and the sun outside still merciless and high. She pulled her second blanket off the shelf and spread it over May, who had gone to sleep with one small hand curled against her cheek. Caleb was watching her. He'd been watching her for the last 20 minutes, she realized, in the steady and unhurried way that some men had, not threatening, not rude, just paying attention. "You gave us your last water," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. You needed it more than I did. That's not an answer. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I did. He was quiet for a moment. I'll replace it. I'll replace everything. You don't owe me anything. She sat back down on the stool by the wall, the only piece of furniture in the cabin that hadn't been sold or broken. I didn't do it because I expected something back. I did it because there was a child in the desert, and I wasn't going to leave her there. She held his gaze. That's all there is to it. He looked at her for a long moment, with that same careful, measuring expression that wasn't unkind. Mrs. Crow, he said finally. Eliza. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought exhaustion had taken him under, but then quietly he said, Thank you. It was 2 words. Simple words. She had heard them before in her life from people who meant them about halfway. But something in the way this man said them, the weight he put behind them, the way he said them like they were the smallest possible thing and the largest possible thing at the same time, made her throat tighten in a way she was not prepared for. She turned away and looked out the single small window at the white glare of the afternoon, and let herself feel it just for a moment before she put it away. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about Victoria Ashford or the lawyers or the men who would arrive at her door before this week was out. She did not know that this man's name was going to become the most important name in her life, or that her own name was about to be spoken in a courtroom before a judge, or that the quiet, collapsed, little world she had been surviving in was about to be torn open and rebuilt into something she could not yet imagine. All she knew right then was that the child was sleeping peacefully, and the man was breathing steadily, and outside the heat was finally barely beginning to soften toward evening. She got up and started figuring out how to feed 3 people on what she had left. That was what you did. You looked at what you had, and you figured it out. She had always been good at that. What she was about to discover, what none of them knew, yet least of all Eliza Crow herself, was that surviving on nothing had made her into exactly the kind of woman who could face everything. And everything was coming. Eliza had exactly 3 things left in her pantry that could be called food, without being generous about it. Half a sack of cornmeal, a jar of dried beans that had been sitting on the shelf since before Thomas died, and a strip of salt pork so hard she'd been using it more as a flavor suggestion than an actual ingredient. She stood in front of the shelf and looked at what she had the same way she always did, not with despair, but with the practical arithmetic of a woman who had been making something from nothing for 2 years running. She made cornbread and bean soup. It wasn't much. It was enough. May woke up while the beans were still simmering, lifted her head from the blanket, and said with the frank directness of a child who had apparently decided that nearly dying entitled her to skip small talk. That smells really good. It'll be ready soon, Eliza said. How are you feeling? Better. May sat up slowly, touching her own forehead like she was checking herself. My head still hurts some. That'll pass. Drink this first. Eliza handed her a cup of water. She'd found another half jug tucked under the workbench that she'd forgotten about, the kind of small mercy that felt enormous when you were counting drops. Slow. May drank slow. She was a remarkably obedient child for her age, Eliza thought. The kind of obedience that didn't come from fear, but from genuine trust from a child who had learned that the adults in her life usually meant what they said and said what they meant. Caleb was awake too, sitting up straighter than before. Some of the color returned to his face. He had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it in a slow circle, the way men did when they were thinking something through they didn't quite have words for yet. There's food, Eliza said without looking at him. Such as it is. Whatever you have is more than we deserve, he said. I told you already. You don't owe me. I know what you told me. His voice was quiet but direct. I'm saying something different. I'm saying we're grateful. That's allowed, isn't it? She looked at him then. He was watching her with that steady attention again, the kind that didn't flicker or slide away, and she had the sudden and mildly irritating sense that this was a man who was very difficult to redirect once he'd decided to say something. It's allowed, she said, and went back to the soup, They ate on the floor, all three of them, because that was where May was, and neither adult suggested moving her. Eliza had 2 bowls and 1 plate, which worked out evenly enough. May ate with the focused intensity of a child who had been seriously hungry and knew it, and Caleb ate more slowly, watching his daughter between every bite with the particular vigilance of a parent whose heart had not yet stopped pounding from fear, even though the emergency itself had passed. "Your horses," Eliza said. "What direction were they headed when they spooked?" "North mostly. One of them might have made it back toward the Ridgecrest livery I rented them there day before yesterday." He set his plate down. "I need to send word. My foreman will have men out looking by now." "The Ridgecrest telegraph office opens at 7 in the morning," she said. "First light you can walk in. It's 4 miles, but the morning's cooler." He nodded, but something in his expression shifted, a tightening around the eyes. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." Then when she just kept looking at him, "I'm thinking about how long it'll take for certain people to hear I've been unreachable." "What kind of certain people?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the hat again in his hands. "My wife's family," he said. "The Ashfords. They keep a close eye on May's whereabouts. On mine too, if they can manage it." Eliza waited. She had learned in her years of mostly solitary living that silence was often the best invitation to continue. "My wife Clara died 18 months ago," Caleb said. "Her family, her mother specifically, has been attempting to gain custody of May ever since. The claim is that I'm an unfit father, that the ranch environment is dangerous, that May would be better raised in the Ashford household in Helena." His jaw tightened. "Victoria Ashford has more lawyers than I have ranch hands, and she's not above using all of them." May had gone very still, Eliza noticed. The child was listening to every word with the careful, practiced stillness of a child who has heard these conversations before and learned to be invisible during them so she wouldn't be sent away. "May," Caleb said, suddenly aware. "I know about the lawyers, Papa." May said quietly, "I'm not a baby." "I know you're not." Something moved across his face, painful and tender. "I know exactly what you are." Eliza looked at the little girl, who was looking at her father with eyes that were much older than 7 years had any right to make them, and felt something harden in her chest. Not anger exactly, something more resolute than anger. "They won't find anything wrong here," she said, before she'd entirely decided to say it. Both of them looked at her. "If anyone comes looking before morning," she said, keeping her voice level and practical, "what they'll find is a man and his daughter who had a mishap in the heat and accepted shelter from a neighbor. Nothing unusual about that. Nothing that gives anyone ammunition." Caleb Hart looked at her for a long, still moment. "Mrs. Crow." "Eliza." "Eliza." He said her name like he was tasting how it sat. "You don't know what you'd be stepping into." "I know what I'm already in," she said. "My roof, my water, my decision." Another long moment. Then something in him seemed to settle like a man who has been braced against a wind that suddenly stopped. "All right," he said. May looked between them both and said nothing, but she finished the rest of her soup. The night passed quietly. Eliza gave May the cot and took the floor herself, and Caleb stretched out with his back against the far wall, his hat over his face, his breathing deep and even within 20 minutes. A man who could sleep when he needed to, another sign she thought of someone who had learned to take rest where he could, because he never knew when the next chance would come. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay on the hard floor in the dark and listened to the sounds of other people breathing in her space, a sound she had not heard in 2 years, and felt the strange doubled sensation of it. How wrong it was that it felt good. How much she had not realized she missed it. She was awake before either of them. She always was. She had water heating, and what remained of the cornmeal mixed into a thin porridge by the time Caleb's eyes opened, and she could tell by the way he came awake fully cleanly, no groggy transition, that he was a man who had trained himself out of slow mornings. He sat up and looked at her across the dim room. "You didn't sleep." "I slept some." He let that sit there, neither of them pretending he believed it. You should have taken the cot. May needed it more. May would have been fine on the floor. Maybe. Eliza stirred the porridge. But I didn't want her on the floor. He was quiet for a moment. You're very definite about things. Most things worth being definite about. She said, you already know what the right answer is. You're just deciding whether to say it. He almost smiled at that. It was brief and it changed his face considerably. They ate breakfast in the early quiet, and then Caleb settled his hat on his head, and said he was going to walk to Ridgecrest. I'll be back before noon, he said. I want to. He stopped. What? I want to make sure you have water. He said it plainly without apology. Before I bring my people out here, I want to make sure your well is sorted. That's not necessary, Eliza. He said her name in a way that stopped the sentence cold, not unkindly, but with a quietness that had weight to it. Let me. She pressed her lips together. Fine. He left. May sat on the cot and watched Eliza tidy the small cabin with the same attentive taking-stock expression that her father had, and it struck Eliza suddenly how much of him was already in this child, the way she held herself, the way she looked at things. Do you like it here? May asked. The question caught her off guard. What do you mean, living here, by yourself? May pulled her knees up to her chest. It's very quiet. It is, Eliza agreed. Doesn't that make you sad? Eliza considered the child for a moment the honest weight of the question, and decided she deserved an honest answer. Sometimes, she said. But sad and wrong aren't always the same thing. Sometimes things just are what they are. May turned this over in her head with the slow seriousness of a child who takes ideas seriously. My papa is sad too, she said. He doesn't say so, but I know. Of course you do, Eliza said gently. You know him better than anyone. He misses my mama. May's voice was matter-of-fact, the way children could be matter-of-fact about devastating things, because they hadn't yet learned that they were supposed to soften the edges. But I think he misses having someone to talk to more. At the ranch, everyone calls him Mr. Hart, and nobody just talks to him. You know, Eliza did know. She knew exactly what that was. He talked to me last night, she said. That seemed all right. May looked at her steadily. You talk different to him than most people do. How so? Like he's a regular person, May said simply. Then she paused. He is a regular person, but most people forget that because of the ranch. Eliza filed that away too, tucked it next to the other things she was accumulating about Caleb Hart that didn't quite fit together yet into a complete picture. Caleb was back before 10, not noon. He came through the door, looking like a man who had been moving fast, and there was something different in his face now, a tension that hadn't been there before, coiled and careful. What happened? Eliza asked immediately. My foreman sent 4 men to Ridgecrest yesterday when we didn't come back, he said. They're waiting at the livery, but that's not the problem. He set his hat on the table. Someone from the Ashford household was already there. A man named Pruitt who works for Victoria. He'd been asking about me at the telegraph office, at the hotel, at every business in town. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the edge under it. He knows I was here. Someone saw me walking in this morning. That was fast, Eliza said. Victoria has people in half the towns between here and Helena. He looked at her directly. Eliza, my men are coming here. Pruitt likely already sent word back to Victoria that I stayed the night at a woman's property. She is going to use that. The words settled in the air between them, and Eliza felt the shape of what he was saying before he finished saying it. She had spent 2 years being the subject of whatever the people of Ridgecrest chose to make of her, the large, strange widow who lived alone and didn't come to church and had opinions she didn't bother hiding. She understood exactly what a woman in her position looked like to people who had decided to make her look a certain way. Let them, she said. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen something genuinely surprise him. What? Let them say whatever they want to say. She held his gaze. I know what happened in this cabin. You know what happened. May knows. Whatever story Victoria Ashford tells about it is just a story. Truth doesn't change because someone tells a lie in the same direction. Caleb stared at her. There was something happening in his expression that she didn't have words for. Yet something shifting under the surface like groundwater moving. "You're not afraid," he said. And it wasn't quite a statement, and wasn't quite a question. "I've been afraid before," she said. It didn't help. So I mostly stopped. Before he could respond, they heard the sound of horses coming fast from the east, more than one, the drum of hooves on dry ground growing loud quickly. May scrambled to her feet. Caleb moved to the door and opened it, and Eliza stepped up beside him and looked out. 6 riders coming across the basin at a hard gallop. 4 of them she could see were ranch hands by the way they sat their horses, working men capable and fast. The other 2 were different, better dressed, riding with the deliberate authority of men who had been sent on official business and knew it. "That's Pruitt," Caleb said, his voice dropping to something flat and controlled. "The man on the gray. He doesn't come himself unless Victoria sends him personally." "And the other one, lawyer." The word came out short and hard. "That's a lawyer's coat if I've ever seen one." May stepped up between them and looked out. Her small hand found Eliza's without looking, fingers curling around Eliza's wrist the way a child reaches for solid ground. Eliza did not move. She stood in the doorway of her cabin with Caleb Hart on one side and his daughter's hand on her wrist, and she watched 6 riders crossing her land, and she thought clearly and without panic about what came next. What came next was not going to be simple. She could see that already, in the way Pruitt sat his horse in the set of the lawyer's shoulders, in the speed they were riding at like they wanted to arrive before anything could be arranged to stop them. She had given her last water to strangers the day before, and thought that was the hardest thing she'd face this week. She was wrong. The riders slowed as they approached the cabin, Pruitt pulling his gray to a stop 10 feet out. He was a thin man with a precise mouth and eyes that assessed and categorized everything they looked at. He looked at Eliza the way a man looks at an obstacle he's already decided is minor. "Mr. Hart." He ignored Eliza entirely. "Mrs. Ashford has been most concerned. We'll escort you and the child back to Ridgecrest immediately." "Will you?" Caleb said. His voice was pleasant in the way that is not pleasant at all. "Mrs. Ashford feels given the circumstances." "What circumstances exactly?" Caleb stepped forward off the threshold, one step slow and deliberate. "Which circumstances are those? My daughter and I were caught in a heat storm and accepted shelter from a neighbor. I sent word as soon as I reached town this morning." "What circumstances does my mother-in-law believe require her to send a lawyer to a private residence?" Pruitt's eyes moved to Eliza. He let them stay there just long enough to make his meaning clear without having to say it. "Mrs. Ashford is simply concerned for the welfare of the child." "The child," May said from directly behind Caleb, her voice small and absolutely furious, "has a name." Pruitt didn't look at her. Eliza felt the anger come up in her, clean and sharp and controlled. Not the hot kind, the cold kind. The kind that didn't need to raise its voice because it already knew exactly what it was going to do. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. He looked at her, first time since he'd arrived. "You're on my land," she said, "and you haven't introduced yourself." Something shifted in his precise face, a small recalibration. "My name is Gerald Pruitt. I serve as personal representative to Mrs. Victoria Ashford." "All right, Mr. Pruitt." Eliza kept her voice even and her eyes on his. "Mr. Hart and his daughter are guests in my home. They had an accident and I took them in. That is the entirety of the situation. If Mrs. Ashford has legal concerns regarding her granddaughter's custody, she is welcome to pursue those concerns through whatever court she likes. But you will not come onto my property and speak about a child in front of that child as though she isn't standing right there." She paused. "Are we clear?" Pruitt stared at her. The lawyer on the horse behind him had gone very still, which she took as a sign that she'd said something he recognized as a position. "Mr. Hart," Pruitt said without acknowledging Eliza. "I must insist." "You don't get to insist anything on another person's property," Caleb said. His voice had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that in a courtroom would clear the gallery. "My men are here. May and I will return to the ranch this afternoon. If Mrs. Ashford wishes to continue this conversation, she can have her lawyer speak to my lawyer." "Good morning, Mr. Pruitt." Pruitt sat on his horse for a long moment, looking at the two of them standing together in the doorway of the small cabin, and what Eliza saw in his face in that moment was not defeat but calculation, the expression of a man storing information to be used at a later time. He turned his horse without another word and rode. The lawyer followed. 2 of the 6 riders stayed Caleb's men falling back and waiting at a respectful distance. Caleb let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said. "Well," Eliza agreed. May came out from behind her father and stood beside Eliza and looked at the retreating figures. "Will grandmother send them again?" she asked. "Yes," Caleb said, because he didn't lie to his daughter. "She will." May was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at Eliza. "Will you help us?" The question was so direct and so sincere, and so clearly not the question of a child who asked things she didn't mean, that Eliza felt it land somewhere central in her chest. She looked down at this girl, who had been calling her by her first name since approximately the 2nd hour of their acquaintance. This girl who held onto her wrist when she was scared and said exactly what she thought, and had somehow in the span of one night and one morning carved out a space in Eliza Crow's careful and defended interior that Eliza hadn't known was still available. She looked up at Caleb, who was watching her with the same steady attention he'd been watching her with since he opened his eyes in the dust of the basin and found her face above him. He didn't ask the question himself. He let May ask it, and he waited, and there was nothing in his face that was pressure. Just waiting. "I'll help," Eliza said. "Whatever I can do." None of them knew yet how much that was going to cost her. None of them knew what was already being set in motion in Helena in the offices of Victoria Ashford's lawyers, in the quiet strategic conversations happening between a powerful woman and the people she paid to make the world go the way she wanted it to go. Eliza had stepped into something much larger than a cabin and a jug of water. She just didn't know it yet, but the cold thing inside her chest, the thing that had said, "Let them," when Caleb warned her, the thing that had told Pruitt in a perfectly level voice exactly where the lines were, that thing was already awake. And it had been waiting a long time for something worth the trouble. The Black Mesa Ranch was nothing like anything Eliza had ever seen, and she had told herself on the 4-hour ride out that she would not let it show on her face. She mostly managed it. Mostly. Caleb hadn't asked her to come. He'd said carefully and without pressure that she was welcome to come, that her presence might matter in the days ahead, that May had asked for her specifically, and that he thought his word thought not needed or required, that it might help to have someone in the house who wasn't on his payroll and wasn't afraid of Victoria Ashford. Then he'd waited. She'd looked at her cabin, at the dried-up well, at the garden that was losing its battle with the drought, at the 2 graves behind the property that she could see from the kitchen window. She'd packed what she had, which didn't take long, and said yes. That had been 3 days ago. In 3 days, she had learned the following things about the Black Mesa Ranch. It was enormous. It ran like a small city. It employed more people than lived in Ridgecrest, and every single one of those people had already heard some version of who Eliza Crow was and how she'd come to be there. She could tell by the way they looked at her, the ranch hands, the kitchen women, the foreman whose name was Reed, and who had the face of a man permanently braced for bad news. They looked at her the way people look at something unexpected, taking it apart with their eyes trying to figure out which category it belongs to. She didn't try to make them comfortable. She just worked. On the first morning, she'd found the kitchen at 5 in the morning and started on breakfast before anyone else arrived, because she didn't know how to occupy a space without being useful in it. By the second morning, 2 of the kitchen women had started coming in early too, not quite talking to her, but working alongside her in the way that working people sometimes bridge distance through shared labor when words are too complicated. By the third morning, one of them, a wide, capable woman named Dora, whose forearms were permanently dusted with flour, had started talking. "You the one pulled him out of the basin?" Dora asked without looking up from the dough she was working. I found them, yes. Dora pressed her knuckles into the dough. May talks about you like you hung the moon. May is generous. May is accurate, Dora said with the authority of a woman who had been watching this child for years. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean. Gets that from her daddy. Eliza kept chopping. How long have you worked here? 11 years, before and after Mrs. Hart. Dora paused, and the pause was the kind that contains an entire complicated sentence. Clara was a good woman, but this place needs more than a good woman. It needs one who doesn't break when Victoria Ashford puts her weight against something. Eliza looked up. Dora was still looking at the dough. You're telling me something, Eliza said. I'm making bread, Dora said. What you take from that is your own business. That was the state of things on the morning of the 4th day when everything shifted. Reed came in at 7 with a look on his face that stopped conversation. He went directly to Caleb's study and didn't knock before he opened the door, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about how serious whatever was in that envelope was. Because she'd already learned that Reed knocked for everything. She was in the hallway when Caleb came out of the study. He had the letter in his hand and his face was set in the way she recognized now the controlled version. The version that kept the reaction contained so the people around him didn't panic before he'd had time to think. What is it? She asked. He looked at her for a moment, then held out the letter. It was from Victoria Ashford's legal firm in Helena. Formal language, dense and precise, the kind of language specifically designed to feel like a wall. The substance of it, stripped of all the formal dressing, was this. Victoria Ashford was filing an emergency petition for temporary custody of May Hart, citing the father's recent disappearance as evidence of negligence and citing. And here was the part that Eliza read twice the presence of an unknown woman of questionable character on the Hart property, as evidence of an unsuitable home environment. Questionable character. Those exact words. She handed the letter back to him without a word. Eliza? Don't apologize, she said. It won't help, and I don't need it. She kept her voice steady. When's the hearing? 12 days. He folded the letter. Helena? All right. She nodded once, decisive. Then we have 12 days. He looked at her the same way he had in the doorway of her cabin, when she'd told Pruitt exactly where the lines were, like he was still recalibrating what kind of person she was. You're not going to ask me what they mean by questionable character, he said. I know what they mean. She held his gaze. They mean I'm fat, poor, and inconvenient. That's what that phrase means when it's pointed at a woman like me. I've been hearing it in one form or another my whole life. It doesn't mean anything about my actual character. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to hide or redirect. No, he said. It doesn't. She turned toward the kitchen. Tell Reed to get the ranch accounts in order. If they're going to claim negligence, we need documentation of everything. May's schooling her health the routine here, who sees her on what days. Everything written down. She paused at the doorway. And get word to your lawyer today. Not tomorrow. Today. Yes, ma'am, he said. She stopped and turned back at that, because there was something in how he said it, quiet and genuine, without irony, the way a man says it when he means it as a real thing rather than a social reflex. She didn't have a response for that, so she went to make more coffee. The next 12 days were the hardest and most purposeful that Eliza had spent since before Thomas died. She had forgotten what it felt like to have something worth fighting for that was bigger than her own survival. The feeling was uncomfortable and clarifying in equal parts, like stepping out of a dark room into cold air. She helped Reed compile records. She sat with Caleb's lawyer, a steady and underestimated man named Amos Greer, and answered his questions about what she had witnessed in the desert, what condition May and Caleb had been in, what Caleb had done, and said how he had behaved as a father from the moment he was conscious enough to behave as anything. Amos wrote everything down, with the slow, deliberate hand of a man who understood that precision was the only weapon he had against a more expensive firm. She talked to May every day. That was the most important work, though. It didn't look like work from the outside. She sat with the child in the evenings, while Caleb was in the study, or out with Reed. And she listened, and May talked. And what came out of May over those 12 days was the portrait of a little girl who was loved steadily and absolutely, and who knew her father's love, the way children know water, as a thing that was simply always there. That was the evidence that mattered most. Not the paperwork, not the testimony. The steadiness of this child. The trouble came on the 8th day in the form of a man named Whitfield. Eliza had been in the main room when she heard the raised voices from outside. She recognized Caleb's voice she'd learned already, the difference between his normal voice and the controlled one. And this was something below both of those, something quieter and more serious than either. She walked to the door and opened it. There were 4 men on horseback in the yard. 3 of them were clearly hands of some kind, tough and armed. The 4th was dressed better, a broad man in a gray coat with an expensive hat, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had slowly become something harder. "Whitfield," Caleb said. His voice had no heat in it whatsoever. "Just wait. You're not welcome on this property. Now, Caleb." The man's voice was smooth in the way that oil is smooth over something it's trying to cover. "No need to be unfriendly. I'm just paying a social call. Heard you had some trouble recently. Wanted to make sure everyone was doing all right." "Everyone is fine. You can go." Whitfield's eyes moved to Eliza in the doorway. He looked at her with the same categorizing expression Pruitt had used, but where Pruitt had been calculating Whitfield was something else. There was an enjoyment in it that made her skin tighten. "This the woman from the papers," he said. "The one Victoria's all worked up about." "This is Mrs. Crow," Caleb said. "And she's none of your concern. Interesting?" Whitfield was still looking at Eliza. "Just interesting is all. Victoria was describing you as some kind of, what was the word, opportunist." He let the word sit in the air, smiled at it a little. Eliza stepped off the threshold and walked toward the horses. Not fast, not aggressive. Just direct the way she did everything. She stopped 10 feet out and looked up at Whitfield on his horse and said, "I don't believe I know you." He blinked. He'd expected her to flinch or go back inside. She could see it in the reset of his expression. "James Whitfield," he said with a fraction less of the smoothness. "I run the Whitfield operation out of—" "I know who you are now," she said. "I've heard your name this week." She had from Dora, who had been very informative over bread making, and from Reed, who had been less forthcoming but whose expression when the name came up told her enough. "You hold a note on 3 properties adjacent to this ranch. You've been trying to acquire them for 2 years. And you have a professional relationship with the Ashford family that you've been careful not to make public." She paused. "So this isn't a social call. It's reconnaissance. And we both know it." Complete silence in the yard. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, and the smile didn't go away, but it changed into something with less performance in it and more reality. "Well," he said, "you're not what I expected." "Most people say that," she said. "It doesn't surprise me anymore." He looked at Caleb, then back at her, then gathered his reins. 12 days, Caleb," he said, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now. "Just so you know, I've given a statement to the Ashford lawyers regarding the financial condition of this operation. There have been questions about the drought losses, about the note you're carrying on the northern pasture." He adjusted his hat. "Just thought you should know what's coming." He turned his horse and left. Caleb stood in the yard and waited until the 4 riders were out of sight before he turned. His jaw was tight. His hands were still. "How bad is the note on the northern pasture?" Eliza asked. A long pause. "Bad enough that a bad season makes it uncomfortable. Not bad enough that it should be anyone else's business." "But it'll be in that courtroom." "Yes," he said. "It will." She nodded slowly. "Then Amos needs to know about it today. Before Victoria's lawyers have the advantage of bringing it up first. You put it on the table yourself, you control the framing. You let them put it on the table, they control everything." He looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" "My husband had debt when he got sick," she said simply. I learned fast. Something crossed his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Go send for Amos, she said. I'll be in the kitchen. She was almost back inside when he said, Eliza. She turned. He was standing in the yard with the afternoon sun behind him, and he looked for just a moment like a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and was only now beginning to understand that he didn't have to. Thank you, he said. Same 2 words as before. Same impossible weight behind them. She held his gaze for a moment, then said, Stop thanking me and go talk to your lawyer. She went inside before either of them could say anything else, because the feeling that was moving around in her chest was becoming difficult to categorize, and she had 12 days to keep her head clear. After that, well. After that, she would deal with after that. That night, May couldn't sleep. Eliza heard her moving around and got up without thinking about it, the way she used to get up for James in the nights when he was restless, the body memory of it still there under everything. She found May sitting on the top step of the back stairs, knees pulled up, staring at nothing. Hey, Eliza said softly, and sat down beside her. Hey, May said back. They were quiet together for a while. Outside the night was still, and the stars were thick overhead. What if the judge believes her? May asked. She didn't say grandmother, just her. What if he believes her instead of Papa? Eliza thought about the easy answer. Then she thought about what May had said, that her papa didn't lie to her, and decided the child deserved the same. That's a real possibility, she said. Victoria Ashford has money, and she has lawyers, and she knows how to make things look the way she wants them to look. She paused. But she doesn't have the truth. And the truth is, your father crawled across 3 miles of desert carrying you when he had nothing left. That happened. No lawyer can make it not have happened. May was quiet. You'll tell them in the court. I'll tell them, Eliza said. Exactly what I saw. Every word of it. What if they don't believe you either? Because of what they said about you. The questionable character part. Eliza felt the cold, clean thing in her chest settle into place like a key finding a lock. Then I'll stand there and let them not believe me, she said. And I'll tell the truth anyway. Because the truth is still the truth, whether anyone believes it or not. And people who are paying close attention usually know the difference between the two. May leaned against her, then just leaned the way a child leans when they've run out of words and the body takes over. Eliza felt the small, warm weight of her settle in, and put an arm around her without making anything of it. They sat there until May's breathing went slow and even. Then in the distance across the ranch, a horse screamed. Eliza was on her feet before the sound finished, and even before she reached the window, she could see the orange light growing in the direction of the north stable, and she knew with a clarity that was worse than panic, because it was cold and certain and immediate that the fire was not an accident. The next 12 seconds were a series of decisions, not feelings. She got May off the stairs and into the main room. She found Caleb's door and hit it hard with the flat of her hand twice. She heard him come awake on the second knock, heard his boots hit the floor. North stable, she said through the door. Fire. May is in the main room. She was already moving toward the kitchen for water buckets by the time the door opened behind her. Outside, the night erupted with voices and boots and the desperate sound of men trying to save something that someone had decided to destroy. Victoria Ashford hadn't waited for the courtroom. She'd sent a message early. And now, Caleb Hart was running toward a burning stable 4 days before a custody hearing with his financial records under legal scrutiny and a note on his northern pasture and a woman in his house that his mother-in-law was calling a person of questionable character. Eliza grabbed 2 buckets and ran. They saved most of the horses. They lost the north stable. By the time the fire was out, the sky had gone from black to the gray-purple of very early morning, and everyone on the property was covered in ash and sweat, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical labor alone, but from fear that has been running underneath the labor the whole time. 3 of Caleb's hands had burns on their arms from pulling the last 2 horses out before the east wall came down. Nobody was dead. That was the thing Eliza kept returning to, standing in the yard with an empty bucket in each hand and smoke still rising from the collapsed structure. Nobody was dead. Caleb came up beside her. He was black with soot from the collar up, and his left hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth that Reed had tied around it at some point during the chaos, a burn not serious but red and angry looking. He stood beside her and looked at what was left. 4 days, he said quietly. Meaning 4 days to the hearing. I know, she said. If they can demonstrate that this operation is in chaos, financially pressured property destruction, animals at risk. I know, Caleb. He stopped, breathed. Someone said it, Reed said, coming up behind them. His voice was flat with controlled fury. I found the start point on the south side of the building. Accelerant, deliberate. Can you prove who? Caleb asked. Reed's jaw tightened. Not by morning. Eliza set the buckets down. Then we don't try to prove it by morning. We document it. Every detail where the fire started, what Reed found, the condition of the horses, the burn patterns. All of it goes to Amos tonight, or what's left of tonight. She looked at Caleb. Victoria's people set this fire to destabilize you 4 days before a hearing. If we walk into that courtroom with a documented arson report and a sheriff's inquiry already opened, it doesn't make you look like a man in chaos. It makes you look like a man who's being deliberately targeted. Those are two completely different stories. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Reed looked at her too. She's right, Reed said with the tone of a man who doesn't say that often and means it completely when he does. Get the sheriff out here at first light, Caleb said. Don't tell him who we think is responsible. Just tell him we need the facts documented before anything is moved or cleaned up. Reed was already walking. Mise. Caleb turned back to the ruins of the stable. He was quiet for a long time, and Eliza let him be quiet because she understood by now that this man processed things in a particular order, first the practical, then the emotional, and interrupting the sequence didn't help him. She burned my stable, he said finally. Not loud, not theatrical. Just said it the way you say a thing when you're still working out whether you believe it's real. She actually burned my stable, 4 days before she walks into a courtroom claiming she wants to protect my daughter. Yes, Eliza said. May could have been hurt. If the fire had started somewhere else, if the wind had changed. I know. She doesn't care. He turned his head and looked at Eliza, and for the first time since she'd met him, the controlled version of his face had slipped enough to show what was underneath it. Not weakness. Nothing like weakness, but a raw and genuine anger that was all the more serious for being so steady. She doesn't care about May. She never did. May is a legal mechanism to her, a way to control the heartland after I'm gone. I know that, Eliza said, and in 4 days we're going to make sure a judge knows it too. He held her gaze. The anger didn't go away, but something shifted alongside it, a steadying like ballast finding its position. I don't know how to thank you for what you're doing, he said. I genuinely don't know how. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. He didn't look away. You walked into this knowing what it would cost you, knowing what they'd say about you. You're still here. I said I would be, she said simply. He nodded slowly. Then he looked down at the wrapped hand, like he'd just remembered it existed, and looked back up. For the record, he said, I'm going to make sure you never have to worry about water, or a dry well, or an empty pantry for the rest of your life. Whatever happens in that courtroom, that's not a negotiation, and it's not gratitude. It's just a fact. She opened her mouth to tell him that wasn't necessary. Don't, he said quietly. Let me say a true thing without you arguing with it. She closed her mouth. He almost smiled. Amos Greer arrived at the ranch before 7 in the morning, summoned by a rider Caleb had sent before the sun came up. He walked through the yard, looked at the ruins, looked at the sheriff's deputy who was already taking notes near the south wall, looked at Eliza and said in his slow and deliberate way, Tell me everything. Leave nothing out. They told him everything. When they were done, Amos sat with his notes for a long moment. his pen tapping very lightly against the paper in the rhythm of a man assembling a structure in his head. "The arson changes things," he said finally. "How?" Caleb asked. "Because Victoria's case rests on a portrait. Negligent father, unstable operation, unsuitable home environment. That portrait depends on the jury of public opinion looking at Black Mesa and seeing disorder." He tapped the pen again. "But if we can demonstrate, and we can, with the sheriff's report with Reed's testimony about the accelerant with the timing 4 days before a hearing, that the disorder is being manufactured and imposed from outside the portrait inverts. Now we're not looking at an unstable operation. We're looking at a targeted one. And a woman willing to endanger animals and risk lives to win a custody case does not look like a grandmother motivated by love." Eliza watched Caleb absorb this. "There's one more thing," Amos said, and the way he said it made everyone in the room go still. "I received a communication yesterday that I came out here this morning to discuss regardless of the fire." He set down the pen. "One of Victoria Ashford's lawyers, the younger one, not the senior partner, sent me a private communication. Not an official one. A private one." "What kind of communication?" Caleb asked. "The kind that suggests not everyone inside that firm is comfortable with the direction this case is going." Amos folded his hands. He didn't say anything specific enough to be actionable, but he indicated that there is documentation within the Ashford legal strategy that concerns him professionally. Documents relating to the Heartland specifically, to the Northern Pasture Note, to certain financial arrangements between Whitfield and the Ashford estate that predate Clara Hart's death. The silence in the room was the specific kind that happens when something finally makes sense that had been wrong-shaped for a long time. Eliza was the first to say it. "She's been planning this since before Clara died." Nobody contradicted her. Caleb's face had gone very still. Still in the way of deep water that has no surface movement but a great deal happening underneath. "She approached Whitfield before Clara was gone," he said. "Not a question. That is what the communication implies," Amos said carefully. "And the custody case isn't about May at all." Caleb's voice was so controlled, it was almost expressionless. "It's about forcing a sale. If she gets custody of May, she has legal standing to challenge the operational fitness of this ranch. If she can demonstrate financial instability, which Whitfield is helping her do by calling in adjacent notes and squeezing the market, she can force a receivership. And in a receivership, the land gets sold to the highest bidder." "Who would be Whitfield?" Eliza said. "Who is already in business with Victoria," Caleb said. Amos nodded once slowly. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, not hiding, just containing. And then he turned around, and he was completely composed. All the way through composed, the kind that isn't performance, but decision. "Can we get that documentation?" he asked Amos. "I don't know yet. The young lawyer hasn't committed to anything. He's frightened of his senior partner, and of Victoria both. But he reached out, which means he's considering it." "Then we give him a reason to follow through," Eliza said. Both men looked at her. "He's frightened," she said, "because he thinks the risk of coming forward outweighs the risk of staying silent. So we change that calculation. We let him know through whatever channel Amos has that his communication has been noted and that his cooperation will be recognized as exactly what it is, a lawyer choosing ethics over a client he believes is engaged in fraud." She paused. "A man like that doesn't want to be remembered as someone who knew and said nothing. You give him the chance to be the person who did the right thing, he'll take it." Amos looked at her the way he'd looked at the sheriff's deputy earlier, assessing, careful, arriving at a conclusion. "You have a very clear way of seeing people," he said. "I've had to," she said. The next 3 days were a kind of controlled storm that Eliza moved through by keeping her attention on the one thing directly in front of her at any given moment. She didn't let herself think about the courtroom as a whole. She thought about what Amos needed. She thought about what May needed. She thought about the truth as she knew it in the specific and concrete detail that couldn't be argued with because it had simply happened. She thought at intervals she couldn't entirely prevent about Caleb, not in a way she was ready to name. Just he was in her peripheral awareness constantly, the way a person becomes when you have been in close quarters with them under pressure, and you have learned exactly how they move and think, and where the edges of them are. She knew now that he was never louder than the situation required. She knew he said her name differently than he said anyone else's name, though she couldn't have specified exactly what the difference was. She knew that when May was in the room, he was always half attending to her, even while doing something else. A parent's divided attention so practiced, it looked like its own kind of single focus. She knew that he'd sat outside her door at 11 o'clock on the second night after the fire, because she'd heard the chair creak, and when she'd opened the door, he'd looked up with the expression of a man who'd been doing something, and gotten caught, except that all he'd been doing was sitting there, and he hadn't apologized for it. Just looked at her steadily, in that way he had, and said, "You all right?" "Yes," she'd said. "All right then," he'd said, and stayed right where he was. She'd gone back inside and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, listening to the quiet, and felt something in her chest that she had genuinely believed was too broken to feel anything again. On the morning of the hearing, Amos arrived with a leather case that was thicker than it had been 3 days ago. He didn't explain it immediately. He set it on the table and looked at Caleb and said, "He came through." Caleb went very still. "The lawyer delivered a copy of the relevant documents to my office last evening. Correspondence between the Ashford estate and Whitfield's operation going back 2 years, including 2 letters that were written 4 months before Clara Hart passed away." He opened the case. "Including 1 letter in which Victoria Ashford discusses in specific terms the legal mechanism she intends to use to acquire control of Heartland once the marriage is. And I'm reading her word resolved." The word sat in the room like something with physical weight. "Resolved," Caleb repeated. "Yes." Eliza watched Caleb's face process this. What Victoria had done, what she had planned, what she had been willing to arrange, it was there in the word, in the implication dark and enormous. She watched him absorb it, and she didn't try to soften it or redirect it, because there was no softening, something like that, and he wouldn't want her to try. "Does this go to the judge?" he asked, finally, his voice as level as she had ever heard it. "It goes to the judge," Amos said. "And I've sent a copy to the territorial prosecutor's office this morning. This isn't just a custody matter anymore, Caleb. This is fraud at minimum, possibly conspiracy. The prosecutor will want to look at the full scope of it. Victoria won't know that when she walks into that courtroom." "No," Amos said. "She won't." Eliza stood up and looked at both of them. "Then let's go." The courthouse in Helena was everything Eliza's cabin was not high ceilings, formal and deliberate, built to make people feel the weight of what happened inside it. She felt every eye in the public gallery register her when she walked in. She felt the specific quality of attention that a woman in her position received in a room like this, the cataloging, the assumption, the quiet verdict that certain people had already reached before she said a word. She sat straight and kept her eyes on the front of the room. Victoria Ashford was already seated at the petitioner's table. Eliza looked at her directly the way she'd looked at Pruitt and Whitfield, without flinching and without hostility, just looked. Victoria was a handsome woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed, with the held posture of someone who had been powerful long enough that it had become her resting state. She glanced at Eliza once, a brief and dismissive assessment, the kind of look that says, "I have already decided what you are." Eliza noted it and returned her attention to the front of the room. The hearing began. Victoria's senior lawyer was smooth and methodical, building the portrait Amos had predicted: negligent disappearance, unknown woman, financial instability, the fire itself reframed as evidence of an operation in crisis. He spoke for 40 minutes, and he was good at it. Eliza acknowledged that without admiring it, the way you acknowledge a tool that's being used wrong. Then Amos rose. He was not smooth. He was precise. There was a difference. He didn't build a portrait. He built a structure, fact by fact, document by document, each piece connected to the next, so that the overall shape of what had actually happened became impossible to avoid seeing. When he produced the letters, the room changed temperature. Victoria Ashford's face did not break. She was too controlled for that. But something left it some certainty that had been load-bearing, and Eliza watched it go. The judge read the letters, read them again, set them down on the bench, and looked at the room over the top of them with the expression of a man who has been on the bench long enough to have seen considerable human behavior and has just seen something that still manages to surprise him. "Mrs. Crowe," Amos said, turning to her, "I'd like to call you to the stand." She stood, walked forward, sat. The gallery was very quiet. Victoria's lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, we must object to this witness. Mrs. Crowe's connection to the Hart household is itself a matter of concern, and her testimony—" "I'll hear the testimony," the judge said without inflection. "You may object to specific questions. You may not object to the witness." Eliza looked at Amos and waited. "Mrs. Crowe," he said, "please tell this court in your own words exactly what you saw on the afternoon of July the 9th in the basin east of Ridgecrest." She took a breath. She thought about the basin, the heat, the sound of a child's voice she had followed without thinking because there was no version of herself that would have walked the other way. She thought about a man face down in the dust with one arm stretched forward still reaching. "I found them in the desert," she said. Her voice was level and clear, and she looked at the judge when she said it, not at Amos, not at Victoria. A little girl on her hands and knees, and a man who had gone down. He'd been carrying her across 3 miles of open ground in the worst heat of the summer when his body finally gave out. She was still moving when I found her. He was not. She paused. "His hands were torn up from crawling," she said. "When he was too weak to walk, he crawled, in the direction of his daughter." The courtroom was completely silent. "When I brought them to my cabin and gave them water," she continued, "the first thing he said when he was conscious enough to speak was, 'Not where am I or what happened. It was, where is May?' That was his first word. Her name." She looked directly at the judge. "I have been a mother," she said. "I know what a man who loves his child looks like. I know what it looks like when it's real, and I know what it looks like when it's performance. What I saw in that desert was not performance. It was a man who gave every last thing he had to keep his daughter alive." She let that sit for a moment. "I will swear to that on anything this court requires." The silence held. Then May Hart, sitting in the front row beside Reed, said in a voice that carried clearly through the whole room, "That's true, every word." The judge looked at her, then at Caleb, then at the letters on his bench. Victoria Ashford said nothing. For the first time since Eliza had seen her, she had nothing to say. The judge did not rule immediately. He gathered the letters from his bench, stacked them with the deliberate care of a man who understood that what he was holding was not just evidence, but the exposure of something that had been hidden for a long time, and he said he would reconvene in 1 hour. Then he stood, and the bailiff called the room to rise, and he walked out through the side door, with the particular unhurried gravity of a man who already knew what he was going to say, and simply needed the hour to say it correctly. The room broke open into noise. Eliza stepped down from the stand and walked back to where Caleb was sitting. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at Victoria's table. She sat down beside Caleb and put her hands in her lap and kept her breathing even. "You were—" Caleb started. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not yet. Wait until it's over." He closed his mouth. He understood about waiting. May pushed through from the front row and sat on Eliza's other side and tucked herself against Eliza's arm without asking permission, the way she'd been doing for 2 weeks now. The way that had stopped surprising Eliza sometime around day 4 and had started feeling like the most natural thing in the world sometime around day 8. Eliza put her arm around the child and looked at the front of the room and waited. Across the aisle, she could hear Victoria's lawyers in urgent, low-voiced conference. She didn't try to hear what they were saying. She could feel the shape of it without the words. The sound of a strategy collapsing in real time, the particular frantic quality of people trying to find solid ground under something that has already begun to give way. She felt Caleb's hand close over hers on the bench between them. He didn't say anything. She didn't move her hand away. They sat like that, the three of them, and waited for the hour to pass. It passed in 43 minutes. The judge came back with the same unhurried gravity and settled himself at the bench and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is about to say it in plain language because plain language is the only kind that serves justice. In the matter of Ashford versus Hart, he said, regarding the petition for emergency temporary custody of the minor child May Clara Hart, this court finds as follows. The room was completely silent. Eliza felt May's fingers tighten around her arm. The petitioner has failed to demonstrate by any credible evidence presented to this court that the child's current living situation constitutes a risk to her welfare or safety. The testimony presented regarding the father's conduct and character, and specifically the eyewitness account provided by Mrs. Eliza Crowe, is credible, consistent, and materially relevant. He paused and looked directly at Victoria's table. Furthermore, the documentary evidence submitted by the respondent's counsel raises concerns of a serious nature that extend beyond the scope of this custody proceeding. This court is formally referring the relevant documentation to the territorial prosecutor for independent review. Victoria's senior lawyer rose. Your Honor. You will sit down, the judge said, in the same even tone he'd used for everything else, and the lawyer sat down. Custody of May Clara Hart remains with her father, Caleb Hart. The petitioner's emergency motion is denied. A standard review hearing will be scheduled for 6 months, hence at which time the court will assess the situation in the ordinary course. He looked at the room one final time. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down. May made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but something in the space between the two, the sound of a child who has been holding her breath for weeks and has finally been told she can breathe. She turned into Eliza's side, and Eliza held her solid and still, the way she would have held James, the way she had always known how to hold someone who needed it. Caleb sat with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a moment. Just one moment. Then he straightened, and he was composed again, but his eyes when he looked at Eliza were bright in a way that he didn't try to hide. It's not completely over, Amos said, leaning in from behind them. The prosecutor's review will take time. Victoria may attempt other legal avenues. The Whitfield situation with the northern pasture still needs to be addressed. I know, Caleb said, but for today. For today, Caleb said, it's enough. They filed out of the courtroom into the afternoon, and Eliza felt the outside air hit her face and took a long, slow breath of it. Helena was noisier and more crowded than anything she'd lived near in 2 years, and for a moment she just stood on the courthouse steps and let herself feel the relief of open air after hours inside that formal and weighted room. She became aware that Caleb was standing beside her. She glanced at him. He was looking at the street, at the people moving through it, at nothing in particular, in the way of a man gathering himself for something he's decided to say. She waited. I want to say something, he said. And I need you to hear all of it before you tell me I'm wrong, or it's not necessary, or any of the other things you usually say when I try to tell you something true. I don't always... He looked at her. She stopped. All right, she said. Go ahead. He turned to face her properly, the way he did when something mattered, full attention, nothing held back or redirected. When I was in that desert, he said, I had made a kind of peace with the idea that May and I were not going to make it. I didn't tell her that. I kept her moving, and I kept telling her it was going to be fine, and I believed it less with every step. And then you were there. He paused. Not just in the desert. After, at the cabin, at the ranch, in that courtroom 20 minutes ago. Every time I turned around and needed someone to be solid, you were there. Not because I asked you to be. Not because you owed me anything. Because that's who you are. Eliza looked at him. Her throat was tight in a way she wasn't going to fight. I know what I'm asking is not a small thing, he continued. I know your life before this was yours, and you'd built it yourself, and that matters. I know what people have said about you since you came to the ranch, and I know you'd rather burn the world down than let it show that any of it cost you anything. I know all of that. He held her gaze. I'm asking anyway, because I think we both already know the answer and we're just deciding whether to say it. She almost smiled at her own words coming back to her like that. "Caleb," she said. "I'm in love with you," he said. "That's the simple version. The rest of it is long, and I'll tell you all of it, every word, as many times as you need to hear it. But that's the center of it. The world around them, the street noise, the people, the horses, and the dust, and the Helena afternoon. All of it continued exactly as it had been, entirely indifferent to the fact that something irreversible was happening on the courthouse steps. Eliza looked at this man who had been a stranger face down in the dust 3 weeks ago. She looked at him and she thought about Thomas, whom she had loved and lost. She thought about James. She thought about the cabin and the dry well and the 2 graves she could see from the kitchen window, and the long silence of 2 years of surviving without a single person who knew her name in a way that meant anything. She thought about the moment she'd poured her last water onto a stranger's lips without a second thought, and how that impulse, that refusal to walk past something that needed her, had led in a straight, unbroken line to this moment on these steps. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "And," he said, steady, waiting. "And I'm in love with you too," she said. That's the simple version. Something in his face that had been carefully held for a very long time finally let go. He reached out and took her hand, not the grab of urgency, but the deliberate, decided hold of a man making a choice he intends to keep, and she let him. And they stood there on the courthouse steps in Helena, Montana, in the afternoon of the day everything changed, and neither of them needed to say anything more for a while. May appeared at Eliza's elbow, looked at their joined hands, looked up at both of them, and said with the frank and devastating accuracy that was entirely her father's, "I knew before both of you." Caleb laughed. It was the first time Eliza had heard him laugh all the way through, without anything held back, and it changed his whole face, and she filed it away, in the place where she kept the things that mattered. "Of course you did," he said. "Dora knew too," May added. "She told Reed, and Reed said it was about time." "I will be having a conversation with Reed," Caleb said. "He won't be sorry," May said serenely, and took Eliza's other hand, and that was that. The ride back to Black Mesa took 4 hours, and May fell asleep between them in the wagon before the first hour was out, her head against Eliza's arm, her breathing slow and easy. Caleb drove, and Eliza sat with the sleeping child, and the territory rolled past, in the long gold light of late afternoon, and neither of them talked much, because there was a kind of silence between them now that was different from all the previous silences. Not the silence of 2 people being careful with each other. The silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to be careful. At some point, Caleb said without looking away from the road, "The cabin, your property." "What about it?" "I want to fix the well, rebuild it properly. If you want to keep the land, and you should keep the land, it should be livable. Not for us to live in necessarily, but—" He paused. "I thought it might serve as something. A place for women who need somewhere to come when they have nowhere else. Lord knows the territory has enough of them." Eliza was quiet for the moment, looking at the road ahead. "That's a good thought," she said. "It was your thought. I'm just finding the practical form of it." She looked at him. He was watching the road jaw, easy, one hand loose on the reins, as settled as she'd ever seen him. "You listen more than most people notice," she said. "I had a good teacher recently," he said. "She's very definite about things." She looked away so he wouldn't see her smile, but she didn't entirely manage it. They got back to Black Mesa in the early evening. Reed was at the gate before the wagon stopped, and his face when he saw them, when he read what was in both of their faces, and in the way they were sitting, and in May asleep between them, did something that Reed's face almost never did. It opened. "Well," he said. "Well." Caleb agreed. "Prosecutor's office sent a writer," Reed said. "They want to talk to you next week about the Ashford letters. And Whitfield's lawyer sent word this afternoon. Apparently Whitfield is requesting a meeting about the note on the northern pasture." "Requesting," Caleb said. "Requesting." Reed confirmed. "Not demanding. Requesting." Caleb nodded slowly. "Tell them I'll meet with them after I've spoken to Amos. On my timeline, not theirs." "Yes, sir." Reed looked at Eliza. "Good day in Helena, Mrs. Crow." "Good enough," she said. He almost smiled. For Reed, that was a celebration. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about the situation simplified overnight, because life does not work that way. And Eliza had never been a woman who expected it to. The territorial prosecutor's review of the Ashford letters was ongoing and would take months. Victoria Ashford had retreated to Helena and gone quiet in the particular way of powerful people who are reassessing rather than withdrawing, more dangerous in some ways than open confrontation. The Northern Pasture Note was eventually renegotiated on terms that favored the heart operation, because Whitfield, it turned out, was considerably less formidable without Victoria Ashford's legal machinery behind him, and without the assumption that Caleb Hart was a man without allies. He was not a man without allies. He had Amos. He had Reed. He had Dora, who had apparently been fighting for this household in her own way for 11 years and was not about to stop. He had the Hands, who had run into a burning stable at 3 a.m. without being asked, because that was the kind of operation Black Mesa was, when it was led by a man who treated people like people. And he had Eliza. They married in October on the ranch with no ceremony to speak of, and every person on the property present, which turned out to be ceremony enough. Eliza wore the best dress she owned, which was not fine by the standards of Helena, but was hers, and Caleb stood beside her with the look of a man who has stopped expecting the good thing to be taken away and has started simply receiving it, and May stood between them and held both their hands and was incandescent with satisfaction. Dora cried. She was furious about it and cried anyway. Reed shook Caleb's hand, and then, in a departure from everything Eliza had observed about him, turned to her and said, "He's better with you here. We all are." Then he walked away before anyone could respond, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. The cabin was rebuilt before winter. Not elaborate. Eliza hadn't wanted elaborate. She'd wanted solid, functional welcoming, and that was what it became. The well was dug deep and clean and never went bitter again. 3 women came before the first snow, referred through a network that Eliza had not organized and could not entirely account for the way word travels when people are desperate and someone somewhere has heard of a place that takes you in. She got them through the winter. 2 of them stayed on in the spring, working the property and helping with others who came after. May rode out to the cabin every week and helped with whatever needed doing, and the women who stayed there began to look at her the way people look at someone who carries goodness in them, so naturally they don't know they're doing it. She was her father's daughter, in the way the best things about a person can be passed on. The 6-month custody review came in the spring. The judge who presided was not the same judge as before, but Amos had prepared everything, and the record was thorough, and the outcome was never really in doubt. The prosecutor's investigation into the Ashford estate and its arrangement with Whitfield had by then become public knowledge in the territory, and Victoria Ashford was occupied with problems considerably more pressing than a custody case she had already lost. May stayed where she had always belonged, with her father, with Eliza, with the life they were building together on the land where she had been loved from the beginning. On the morning after the review concluded, Eliza stood at the kitchen window of the main house and looked out at the ranch in the early light at the new stable that had replaced the burned one at the Hands, beginning their work at May, running across the yard toward the horse barn with her dark hair flying at Reed, watching her go with the expression of a man who has everything he needs to do his job and is doing it well. She stood there, and she let herself feel it. Not the relief this time, not the residual vigilance, but the thing underneath both of those. The thing that had no particular name, except that it was what it felt like when you had stopped surviving and started living. Caleb came up behind her and stood close, and she leaned back against him without turning around, and he put his arms around her, and they watched May reach the barn and disappear inside it. "She's going to want her own horse," he said. "A real one, not the pony. She should have one. You'll have to help me choose it. She listens to you." "She listens to you. She listens to us both differently," he said. "She needs both kinds of listening." Eliza thought about that. About the way May had said weeks ago that her papa was sad because he didn't have anyone to just talk to. about how a child sees the truest things because she hasn't yet learned to look away from them. "Yeah," she said. "She does." He pressed a kiss to the side of her head, quiet and unhurried, the gesture of a man with time, with real, actual time. And she closed her eyes for a moment and just let the morning be what it was. A poor widow who had once rationed water by the cup and walked 8 miles for the chance to trade needlework had become the woman who held this household together. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because she had calculated any advantage in it, but because holding things together was what she had always known how to do, even when the only thing she'd been holding together was herself. The desert that had tried to kill 2 people had brought them to her door. She had given what she had, and what had come back to her was everything.